Hi, and welcome to 9 to 42, the podcast from the team at the Guitar Show UK. Join us for interviews, updates and chat with artists, influencers and those that manufacture the gear that we love. Hello and welcome to 9 to 42, which is the podcast from the guys at the Guitar Show UK. Now, it's a little bit different this week because Jace is flying solo. He had a conversation with John Stewart, who's the guitarist from Sleeper, also played in bands like The Wedding Present, but he was on to talk about his book. So I'll leave you in Jace's capable hands and he's going to pick up the story.
I think your story starts, doesn't it, when you were studying politics at Manchester University?
Yeah, I went through a sort of standard 80s Sheffield childhood, which was pretty much the miners' strike was a big thing, and then basically not much else happened. And I went to university and studied politics, which was basically Marxism degree, because that's the options I chose. I was interested in how that set of ideas explain the world and what had happened to the sort of industrial decline I was witnessing where I grew up. I guess that's kind of shaped my outlook. I wouldn't describe myself today as a Marxist. I'm not even particularly lefty, actually. I'm sort of apolitical now. Marx was a big fan of Charles Darwin and sent him a copy of Capital, actually, funnily enough. And I don't believe Darwin ever replied. But there was a book out when I was doing my degree called Sociobiology, which is an evolutionary psychology foundational text. And I remember it coming out and reading it as a student and thinking, it came out just before I was a student, but I remember seeing it on bookshelves and thinking, oh, that's interesting. I was told not to read it because it's the anti-Marx text. It's a debate that's been revived recently by Steven Pinker in his book The Blank Slate, which looks at that idea about do we have a human nature or not? And it's the old nature-nurture debate. And so I never read it, and I think probably Marx would have really enjoyed it, actually, and been quite a fan of it. One of my lecturers was Norman Garris, who was an authority on Marx and human nature, and argued that Marx did have a position on human nature. He literally wrote the book on it. And Norman Garris, who sadly passed away a few years ago. So I kind of got interested in that whole working class politics, and then later in life, just kind of reinvigorated my interest in what is now known as evolutionary psychology, which is the last chapter of the book. And it's a combination of Dylan and Lennon, my two favorite songwriters, and Marx, because I think it's an interesting way of looking at the world, taken through a guy who analysed protest music in America, and a literary theorist, Frederick Jameson, Serge Denisov, the protest music sociologist, and Frederick Jameson, the literary theorist. They look at through them. I look at Dylan and Lennon's protest and their idea of their heritage, and then the last chapter is this kind of evolutionary psychology analysis of their belief systems. So it pulls out from one issue, which is anti-war protest songs in the 60s, through to a kind of a broader historical look at 19th century heritage that both artists displayed that's often overlooked, and then into the grand issue of who are we and why are we here and what does it mean to be human, through the long history of evolution, human evolution, and how that's put its stamp on who we are today in issues around largely with them around their belief systems, which are very different but share a lot of similar processes, I would argue.
Well, I mean, I've literally just finished. I read the last bit, the Appendix 2 bit I read just before, which is Dylan's relationship with the other Beatles, not Lennon. We should say, actually, the book we're talking about is Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God, that came out. Did it come out just before Christmas?
Supposed to come out early February, and then Cambridge University they delayed publication because of COVID, and then they forgot to push the button on it, so it came out to a yawning chasm of zero publicity about 2 weeks before Christmas.
But perfectly, a new book coming out just before Christmas, just as Get Back is coming out.
Yeah, but I forgot to tell anyone. So yeah, so it's just in our world, it's just come out, or it's due out next week. Although you can actually buy it and have been able to buy it for a while.
But I mean, I say I've just finished reading it, and it just blew my mind. If I'm perfectly honest, and I to describe it, I mean, it kind of starts, I think, with the premise of so Dylan starts as a protest singer, but as he moves forward throughout his career, he kind of is leaving that in the background, whereas Lennon starts singing "Love, Love Me Do" and so on, and then develops into a protest singer with "Give Peace a Chance" and "Imagine" and so on. And at some point, probably in the late 60s, they kind of cross.
Yeah, yeah.
And then start to diverge again after that. But at some point in the late 70s, they seem to come round together again.
So it's this concept of dual biography, which I took from an American woman called Eloise Knapp Hay, who was the first person to really write about it. And she argued that in a good dual biography, you learn more about the people involved than you would in an individual biography. And with those two, the protest songs is a really good comparison. And I'm looking particularly at international politics and anti-war songs, because domestic politics, it would probably look quite different. But in the issue of anti-war politics, Dylan starts off as a traditional American folk songwriter, and he's writing these what Arsac Denisov, the great Marxist sociologist, calls magnetic songs, which are problem solution, and the solution is the class-based answer of form a revolutionary communist party and overthrow the system, basically. And so you state the issue, and that comes from the American tradition of, you know, Woody Guthrie or the Wobblies and the songwriters in the early working class movements in America in the early 20th century. And Dylan writes this one song, Plague Boys and Playgirls, which is this fantastic analysis of American politics. Pete Seeger falls in love with it, says it's going to be sung by 1 million people before the year's out, and about a year after starting writing political songs, Dylan just backs off completely, and explains why, ironically, in song. But essentially, he doesn't want to get shot, I think, is the real reason. And as the 60s progressed, he had famously band members leave because they didn't want to be stood alongside him on stage, because they felt it was a risky place to be, because he was such a powerful political voice. But throughout that whole time, he watered down his politics very much. So he starts off with really trenchant, you know, Masters of War, which is a brilliant critique of the military-industrial complex. And then 3 years later, he's writing Tombstone Blues, which is an or Highway 61, both of which are anti-Vietnam War songs, but you have to completely decode them to realize that. So he waters down the politics, and he goes from this traditional campaigning song into a much more rhetorical, you know, obscure statement of politics, based much more around feelings and metaphors and coded observations. And Lennon takes the opposite journey. Lennon's, because he's in the biggest boy band in the world, he starts off writing quite coded songs, and all his politics comes in his books, which are very full of real trenchant political statements. But his songs are things like, you know, the word, and the word is love. So it's essentially a peace song quite early on, I argue. But then all you need is love is a more overt articulation of that idea. And then he ends up being one of the last people in the late 60s, early 70s, writing these traditional protest songs, such that, you know, Give Peace a Chance. And in fact, he follows up Imagine with an entire album of classic magnetic problem solution protest songs, which is Sometime in New York City, which absolutely bombs because it's now so outside the zeitgeist of what protest music should be. And I just thought Denisov, although it's quite an old way of looking, he was a sociologist in the 60s and founded some of the big, or one of the big academic journals on popular music studies, but it was a long time ago. Not that many people, his ideas are still used, but he's not really written about that much today. But I just thought it was a good way of comparing them, and it shows they do cross over. About 65, Dylan's completely abdicated the role. Lennon's taken it up, and of course, subsequently, it is John who's shot. He's shot because he's the political Beatle. He didn't come after Ringo. No one's going to assassinate the guy who's narrating Thomas the Tank Engine. That would be
that'd be terrible.
You'd never get out of prison if you did that. Oh, hang on, he's still waiting for parole, isn't he? But
he is, yeah.
I guess it didn't make much difference. But yeah, so that I just thought it was an interesting journey in that respect that they were on.
I can only assume when you write a book like this, and the way that you've decoded both Dylan and Lennon's lyrics, you must have been a massive fan before you decided to take this on.
Yeah, huge fan. I just wanted to do it justice, really, and it's quite difficult to write about them in original ways, and it's also become quite unfashionable to write about them because we're in a period when we're decolonising the curriculum in cultural studies. But again, with the history chapters, there's a lot of relevant stuff there because they are so mired in 19th century and their view of it. And it's based on my PhD, and I just thought if you're going to do a PhD, do it about something that you love, because you're going to get. If you don't, it's going to be hard anyway. If you're not doing it about something that you genuinely love, then you haven't got a chance of completing it. So that's why I picked, and that's what the script's based on, which is it's quite a scholarly work, although it's tidied up for. I took some of the long words out. A lot
you took some of the long words out. Jesus Christ! I read it with a dictionary by myself.
Yeah, it's a bit. It is. It's quite. You can. There's quite a lot in there. Yeah, apologies for that. I should.
No, it's interesting though because it. What I did like when you talk about the sort of like Lennon's 19th century attitudes with everybody has watched. Everybody I know has watched the Beatles documentary over Christmas because, quite frankly, you need several days to be able to consume it all. And we were talking in the kitchen at BIM actually, loads of us about it. And I'd always, the way I view it, and I don't know if right or wrong, that because the Beatles started a couple of years before the Stones. And the Stones are effective, whilst I know they're not actually from London, they are from London. And the Beatles are from, a northern outpost, if you like. And I would imagine, to me, the 2 years difference between the first album sort of thing is a huge... The Stones have a 20th century attitude, and that's why the Beatles do music hall songs and so on. It just that little bit of, I suppose, geography and... a couple of years is a completely shift, and I thought it was really interesting that when Let It Be comes out, the Stones have got Let It Bleed come out, which and as much as I love the Beatles, I watched that documentary in complete awe, and I went, they had to stop now because it just seems so out of step with that late 60s, early 70s Vietnam War. Everything's getting a little bit darker.
Yeah, and you got to think about their influences. They're really mired in that music hall tradition. George Formby was a massive influence on the Beatles.
Yeah,
and no one really thinks of that because it's not cool, but it's true. And I guess it's that music hall, working class, pre-television entertainment that they did so much to break through. The first working class voices on British television, for example. But within that, I argue in the book, that goes really deep. It's really hidden in there. So, and the first place you see it is in Lennon's writing, because much like with his protest, he can express himself much more clearly because he's not bound by the strictures of being in a boy band and having to write "Love Me Do." So in his books, it's full of class and heritage and lots of metaphors about the empire and people going to strange lands far away and meeting weird animals and stuff, which is a classic sort of British Empire narrative. And then it appears in songs in this sort of fascination he's got for the 19th century. And probably the biggest example is Mr. Kite, where that's when you work out what that song's about, it's a poster for a benefit show for a performer who's leaving the circus, and he's a horseback performer. And the reason why the British circus in the 1800s had a tradition of horseback performance was because of all the cavalrymen coming back from the empire with nothing to do, but they were just brilliant horsemen. So they then joined the circus and became trick horse riders. And that's obviously a tradition that's now completely gone, but it's absolutely founded in the back end of the 100 Years' War and the British various horse campaigns that happened around the world in Spain and against Napoleon and stuff. And when those things wound down, these guys came home and were like, "Oh, I better join the circus." And then so it's mired in empire. And then this character, which is a true story, obviously based on a poster that Lennon bought in a junk shop or antique shop, and then the Mr. Kite's retiring or is injured or he has to stop performing for some reason, and there's no social security. So this is a worker's benefit for a retiring performer, and he's in a circus owned by somebody who turns out to be the biggest black media figure in Victorian Britain, which is Pablo Fank, the circus owner, who probably from North India, but no one's really quite sure, who owned this huge circus, and he was very much the big charity figure of his day, and he would do these benefits on a regular basis because he made so much money. So the story of the way the British working class is entwined with the greater narratives of being in the empire, and how kind of diverse our culture is, and how some of our traditions are founded in spin-offs of that process of exploring the world and exploiting it and bringing it home and stuff, are riven throughout Lennon's songs. And I think it's particularly visible at that, but you don't really notice it until you actually start to think, hang on, what's this all about? And it just sounds like an acid nonsense song, but it's not. And obviously a lot of his other songs in that frame are doing the same thing. It sounds, Tomorrow Never Knows just sounds like a drug trip, but it's actually based on a European adaptation of a sacred Indian text. So it's actually about dying and meeting God and then being reincarnated, which is strong Vedic tradition that runs right through Lennon's work. There's loads of, much as Dylan has hundreds and hundreds of metaphors from the Bible, Lennon, from quite early on, is drawing from Vedic traditions in his work. In his first book, this whole idea that Dylan introduced them to the Beatles to cannabis, which is nonsense. Lennon had been smoking cannabis for years. In fact, he's written about it in his book. He's written about Indian Hump in his book which came out just before he met Bob Dylan.
I was going to say, weren't they smoking it in Hamburg anyway?
Of course, yeah, they were smoking it probably 1960 in Liverpool is when they had their first. But it's gone down in history as being this moment when it's probably the first time they had grass, possibly if they're in America. But there's a famous moment in the first Hard Day's Night movie where Lennon snorts at the top of a Coke bottle and like does a bit of eyebrow raise. So he's literally punning on snorting Coke, and turns to Wilfred Bramfell and does this sort of cheeky little grin. So he's very well aware of various drug tropes, and one of his early references to cannabis is to Indian hemp. So this whole tradition, at the same time in Help, they're pictured sort of wandering into a curry house, being all confused about Indian culture and what's all this stuff, But and the whole film's about them, being chased around the world by this kind of bizarre racist portrayal of this kind of strange Indian figure. I think they're probably quite familiar with lots of those ideas, and so it's in fact it's mired in their songs. Particularly Lennon, if you scratch beneath the surface, all along it transpires. I think. I mean, his dad was in the Merchant Navy. His dad spent years sailing around the world from port to port. The whole reason the British Navy existed it wasn't to go and conquer the world; it was to guard the Merchant Navy. The British Empire was essentially a trading system. It started with trade in India. I mean, a slightly coercive form of trade, but nonetheless trade. The British India Company was all about exploiting natural resources from India, and the navy was to defend those trading ships and from pirates initially, and that's what Lennon's dad did. His whole life was mired in that tradition as well. And then he had grandparents who allegedly, if you believe some of the stories, went over to America and performed in minstrel shows over there. In fact, that's why he learned the banjo. That was from Lennon's grandfather, who was apparently a banjo player, because he brought one back from America, allegedly.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating that those links run deep. You got to remember, if you went to school in the United Kingdom in the 1950s, there's a strong possibility your teacher would have been born when Queen Victoria was alive.
Yeah.
That's the tradition he grew up in,
Yeah. In fact, if you went to school in the 70s, like I did, there was a good chance your teacher was born when Queen Victoria was on the throne.
Yeah, my dad had a very, very, very much a Victorian childhood, and then there's all the things around that, maps on the walls with all the bits of the empire coloured pink and the sun never set on all that stuff. And then obviously the Beatles come to being the biggest British export since the British Empire, just as the British Empire is collapsing. So every year in the 60s, about 8 or 9 countries disassociate from the British Empire. Former Empire territories leave the Empire. Just every year when the Beatles are conquering new land with the power of song, those same countries are withdrawing from the British Empire and becoming part of the Commonwealth, and now leaving the Commonwealth as it transpires. So yeah, it's all there, I think, if you scratch under the surface.
So I get the impression that this book has taken you a long time to write, probably 40 years in the making or something. But how long did it actually take you to write it?
Well, I did it on and off over a few years. It's based on a PhD script. So it started off as it began as a story about protest songs. I wanted to know where, after the Gulf War in 2003 to 5 or whenever that sort of finished, I was struck by the lack of protest music, and I started writing about that. That's what my PhD was going to be. And I kind of concluded that there wasn't any anti-war protest music because we didn't have conscription, whereas in the Vietnam period we did have. Well, America had conscription, hence huge amounts of protest songs. And if we would have had conscription, which came quite close in the United States because they were running out of troops and sending people for the third or fourth tour of Afghanistan. And in fact, recently that war has finished with America losing, so they Vietnam themselves in Afghanistan quite conspicuously, as have we, partly because they've run out of troops. People don't want to go back anymore, and troops and treasure, they haven't got them. Not going to make it work, it transpires. So I was just interested in where the absence of protest music was and why that was such an important thing in the 60s, and that turned into a book chapter which I got published in an academic work on protest music. And then off the back of that, I just couldn't get beyond Dylan and Lennon and their anti-war songs. So I just thought, this is turning into more of a thing about them, and that's when it became a PhD. So it did take a while, but it was done in periods of intense activity followed by periods of not doing very much because other things were going on, like my job and stuff. So it took a few years, and then after PhD, my supervisor very kindly sent the script to Cambridge University Press, and they were like, "Yeah, stick it out. We love it."
Another book by Cambridge Press that was like a series of articles about the Rolling Stones that have been compiled in a book, to be honest, but they were proper academic pieces of work about the Rolling Stones, and it was just like a very different way of, because whilst I can see your library of books about the Beatles behind you, that what you can see behind me is essentially the same thing on the Rolling Stones.
Oh, excellent.
I don't think I'll be writing a PhD on the Rolling Stones though. But my favourite book on them in the weird and wacky, as we were talking about before we started recording, is Up and Down with the Rolling Stones, which was written by their drug dealer.
Ah, superb. Fantastic. Yeah.
Tony Sanchez. Yeah, amazingly, they sued to get that one stopped. Had to pick up a second-hand copy of it somewhere.
They're the best ones to get. The ones that got stopped are always the best books. The ones that are no longer in print, yeah. They're always, and there's quite a lot of Dylan and Lennon, particularly the Beatles. But yeah, and the eyewitness stories, because they can be quite valuable. They're not, they're not academic ones, but they're first-person narratives of what happened, and often they clash as well. So it was interesting to find some of those. What people get wrong is interesting. That there's a famous song that Dylan and Lennon never wrote together called "Pneumonia Ceilings," which was the product of their meeting in London in 1966 when they were filmed in the back of a car, and it's completely fictional. It's in a fictionalized novel about the rise of the Beatles called Paperback Writer. But so much did we want Dylan and Lennon to work together that it's transpired to be recorded in Michael Gray's superb Bob Dylan encyclopedia in both editions of it with all the lyrics. And there's versions of it on Spotify that people have done. So there's so much did we want Dylan and Lennon to work together that a song they never wrote together is now available on Spotify. Which I kind of
it is interesting.
Love that.
It's interesting though, isn't it, when you consider that George Harrison was in a band with him, and he toured with. I think he did the Rolling Thunder. He played on that for some of the dates and stuff. And it's like, I wonder whether, because they're both quite strong personalities, that they could never actually work together. The great thing about George Harrison is he seems to be able to bend and fold around whoever he's with.
It's interesting that because, I think as musicians really only understand this stuff. I mean, the Get Back film is a great example. All the journalists who aren't musicians are saying how boring it is. Everybody I know who's a musician who's ever sat in a room and tried to work out a song with a group of other people has gone, this is just incredible. And it really separates the wheat from the chaff in that respect. And I think that's a fantastic observation that probably only a musician would make, because
I'm a musician.
Speaking as so I'll call myself a sort of a musician. But that idea that I think when you work with people, like I've been lucky enough to I played on the KD Lang record.
I was on your Wikipedia page. I don't know if you've created the Wikipedia page, but someone's created a Wikipedia page.
I didn't know.
And it talks about the KD Lang. Is it Invincible?
Yes,
Summer
yeah.
You're on,
but
also Mel C's Reason album, which I listened to this afternoon. I was like, this is all right, actually.
Somebody, I was walking on Brighton Seafront during the pandemic. Someone had a tattoo of that on that cover on their leg. And I was like, I'm on that record. They were like, oh, yeah, it's my favourite album. And it's all very Brighton. Yeah, I think when you work with strong personality lead singer people, as I've been lucky enough to do, given the sort of modicum of talent I've got as a musician, and Harrison understood how to work around other people, so he works really well with Dylan, and their collaborations together are quite outstanding because he's so musical, and you can tell the songs that they wrote together because the sort of guitar figures that he has and the chord changes and stuff that Dylan wouldn't have come up with, and that's Harrison very gently kind of putting himself in the music alongside this guy who's his idol. And then when Dylan and Lennon meet, I know it was only the one time it's captured on film in the back of the car in 1966. They're both so freaked out by each other's aura that I don't think anything would have happened. A bit like when Dylan worked with Johnny Cash. You would have thought that was going to be great, but if you actually listen to that session, it doesn't quite work, because who's going to tell Johnny Cash you're coming in wrong? And who's going to tell Bob Dylan that's not quite working? Whereas if you're George Harrison, you spend your whole life working out how to very gently say to McCartney or Lennon, how about we do it this way, and then make them think it's their idea all along. And then that's how you fix a song. If you're not the alpha male in the group, that's how those things work. So he's very skilled at that. And I think only a musician would have noticed that.
Cool.
Which is why there needs to be more musicians writing about music. I think that's really important. I love the amount of scholarship on popular music that's happened in the last 20 years, but not nearly enough of it is by people who are musicians.
I do think, and I think that's one of the things that when we were all sat in the kitchen at BIM talking about Get Back, it is that complete awe of watching them. That, you know, there's the bit where like McCartney is at the piano. I think it's Let It Be he's playing, and he's going down, 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 down. No, not that one. No, that one, that one. He's like, oh God, we've all done that. You know, he can't figure out what the next chord should be, and it's just such a wonderful moment, sort of thing. You know, and when he's kind of writing Get Back, and he's just like strumming the bass, well, left-handed like that. And it's just like you're seeing this stuff sort of unfold in front of your eyes, and it's just really exciting. I mean, it didn't feel like 8.5, 9 hours to me. It was.
Yeah, that's the magic, isn't it? We've all got, and that's the other thing that I think there's a famous quote where a journalist is sort of asking, I can't remember who it was, a songwriter or a musician, about how they create this incredible magic, and the person's just like, well, it's practice, actually. And just, but it's like, you just generate this incredible stuff out of the ether, and it's just it has such an effect on people. And the guy's like, yeah, I practice a lot, you know. And the journalist can't understand where this incredible magic comes from. And the musician just keeps saying, well, it's practice. It's the old 10,000 hours thing, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, and they did those 10,000 hours in Hamburg before anybody heard them.
Yeah. And again, that's very much a sort of a post-war situation for them to be in, and that sort of unusual experience that they had entertaining over there. And that must have been really bizarre to be in Hamburg in the 60s. I think quite a unique cultural moment. I was reading about, because obviously this stuff's kicking off in Ukraine. You know, Königsberg, which is now a Russian city on what was Danzig, you know, what was a German city. It's now completely populated by Russians. After the war, they kicked all the Germans out. I mean, not many people realize how many Germans died on the long trail back from the Eastern Europe, where they tried to expand for Lebensraum and all that stuff. And they were just, I mean, it's possible 2 million Germans died in Eastern Europe after the war, through starvation and freezing to death, and thousands drowned in the Baltic Sea in the winters after the war when they were being kicked out. And when I say thousands, I mean tens of thousands drowned. And no one, obviously, post World War II, no one cared because of what had happened. And I suppose, you know, the stuff that happened, particularly around the vulnerable populations, particularly women in Berlin and stuff, that there's been a bit of history around that, and the horror stories around that. But more generally, that post-war period that the Beatles inserted themselves into in Hamburg as young, drunk British musicians in this major port, with Lennon stumbling around doing, you know, throwing up Sieg Heil straight arm salutes left, right, and centre, and having to be protected by the club bouncer on a regular basis. You know, just because he thought it was funny, because he's got that sort of, you know, just absolute crazy head on him, and probably quite drunk as well, I would imagine at the time. And then continuing to do that. There's a fantastic bit of film where he does it at the Hard Day's Night premiere in Liverpool. Him and Ringo walk out to the balcony, 10,000 people, and Liverpudlians. It's the big northern premiere of a Hard, and Lennon throws up his right arm, and you could read his lips, shouts Sieg Heil. And Ringo's like, what the fuck are you doing? And sorry. And I imagine he F-bombed him. And he's like, take your arm down. And Lennon puts his arm down and looks a bit sheepish. But then either just before that or just after that, they arrive in Australia when Ringo's not there. And Lennon does the same thing in front of 10,000 people in, I think it's Adelaide or the Australian cities where the Beatles are there. And everyone's just freaked out because the Beatles are in Australia. And the rest of the band do it. There's that picture of the book, which cost me quite a lot of money to license. Actually, it's the most expensive picture in the book of them on a hotel balcony in Australia. All three of them doing a Roman salute, and all the dignitaries just laughing their heads off. I think it's hilarious. Because Ringo, the conscience of the Beatles, it transpires, wasn't there. George has got his arm up. Who'd have thought that? Lovely Buddhist George Harrison doing it.
I do wonder. You know, I mean, it's one of those things where you can say it's just one of. It's a symptom of the times, because you know you'd got in the 70s you got Freddie Starr running around on TV and all of that, and it was very funny in the 70s. It's just not very funny
it shows how history imprinted on their work. And there is a moment which is on YouTube. There's a link to it in the book where Lennon walks out of an elevator backstage. It must be what I've tried to find out, which it's a service elevator. It's a backstage, equipment, technical elevator. It's all graffitied with chalk all around it. And he walks out and he's in the middle of it. He's surrounded by a TV crew. They're conducting a sort of walk and talk interview with him. How's he finding New York? It's their first night in a hotel in New York. And it's either the big TV station they did, or it's backstage at the show they did there, and which was never filmed, that particular show. And someone's chalked what looks like a giant swastika really high up on the wall, and he stops the interview and he makes the case of look at that. He goes, stamp that out. You've got to stamp that. He's really angry to see it up there. It turns out it's backwards. It's because the swastika is a Hindu symbol, and it's the sub. I don't know how you say it, it's savustika or something like that, which is the backwards version. But he takes it for a genuine piece of fascist graffiti and gets really upset, such that he interrupts the interview and makes the cameraman capture it and says, "You've got to stop this. What's going on here?" So it's fascinating, the jocularity and then the seriousness that I've worked really hard to try and find out. I was looking at like building maps of the Ed Sullivan Television Theatre, and then the gig that they did, which is can't remember the name of the big New York venue that they played there. And I still
wasn't the Garden, was it?
No, it's the big white theatre on the corner there. I can't remember. It's the big New York theatre. I can't remember the name. The one where everyone goes to, and it's the one where Robert Johnson nearly played and then got killed. I can't remember. It's the big New York theatre.
Which reminds me, actually, a couple of years ago, I was in New York and you emailed me and said, "I've got a new album coming out," and I was like, "Cool, I'm in New York." And so I bought it whilst I was sat on my hotel bed.
Oh, wow.
And it was waiting for me when I got back. So that would have been 2019?
Yeah, 2018 maybe, I think. Yeah. The Sleeper album. Yeah, set 18, 19. Yeah.
So I just wanted to touch on Sleeper, because for the way, what I remember, you split up late 90s. I read that you went off and moved to California, Los Angeles. Why not? Brilliant. You do a couple of albums of session work. There is an album on Spotify called by UFO Bro. I don't know if you were on that one.
I played with them, but I'm not on that record. But I played on the tour for that album, which I really love that record, actually.
Yeah, I was really enjoying listening to it today. And then you come back and you join BIM, and you start there, and BIM must have been right in its infancy at that point.
Yeah.
Are you still playing guitar, or have you just actually stopped making music?
I joined a band in Brighton called Chimp, which I actually started managing, so I just loved their music. And then the second album, they were like, "Do you want to play some guitar on it?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." So I played and did some shows with them. And then after that, didn't do very much at all for about 10 years. Played at a friend's wedding, and then hung up the guitar after that. And that friend's now, his daughter's now quite grown up, and they're divorced. So it's been, it's that long ago. Yeah.
That long. So what happens when you get the call? Sleeper, shall we reform? Do you just look at your guitar and go, "Shit, how'd you play that?"
Pretty much, although fortunately the Sleeper songs were never that complicated in the first place, so it didn't take that long to relearn them. But I'd loaned out all my pedals over the years, so I had to replace them, which cost a fortune. Although fortunately they'll come in smaller versions now, so much more portable. And I had to get I used to have a lovely old Marshall head that I got reconditioned, and then no one uses Marshall heads anymore in 4x12, so then I ended up buying a smaller version. I got given a Victory, actually, which sounds pretty cool, the white one. And I've actually got a Victory in a 1x12, like a 1x12 Marshall cab, which I don't use live. It's not quite beefy enough, but so that the gears all shrunk, and we'd kept hold of the original guitars, so had to have most of them rewired because they'd just been sat around not doing very much for a while. And one of them's refretted. But the just got the old gear up and started working out what I'd done on the various songs, and I mean, in the intervening years, I got sober as well, so I found it all a lot easier actually the second time around because I wasn't distracted by being an idiot. I could just get on with working out what I'd done the first time around, which wasn't that complicated. The wedding present stuff was more difficult, although they're another quite simple band to play, but that's like Peter's my guitar hero, so getting his stuff note perfect, which I think I've done on the Sea Monsters album, which is a huge album. To be able to play that from start to finish with no breaks, no word from David, pretty much as accurately as it's ever been played since it was written, because I've studied all the video of everyone, the guitarists he's had over the years. That's been quite cool. And I couldn't have done that if Sleeper hadn't reformed, that's for sure. I'd have been struggling. I'd have been struggling to do that.
You go from not playing for about 10 years to all of a sudden being in 2 touring bands.
Yeah.
Almost within, 18 months of each of them?
Yeah. And by invitation, I wouldn't have chosen to do it, but I couldn't say no because I'm just such a fan of, particularly Bizarro, actually. I mean, that's got like a 9-minute Take Me, which is a 9-minute song, which is, for me, the greatest indie song ever written. I just love it. And then just huge riffs as well, massive riffs, and very simple, harmonically not very challenging, but very much, I guess, much like the Pixies were. Stuff that, or Velvet Underground, although that some of their stuff is quite well written, actually, obviously. But some of their simple stuff, there's not a lot going on there musically in terms of chords and scales, but it's just such a great tune. And I think Louise as a songwriter is similar as well, just very, very good ear for a top line. And I will also say for Louise, a brilliant lyricist, amazing lyricist. So as a guitarist, I'm just trying to keep up really and not make it shit over the years.
I always thought that her literary career that sort of came post Sleeper was a really obvious step. I mean, I read the for the life of me, I can't remember what it's called now, the sort of like the summing up of Sleeper, the autobiography,
the memoir
sort of thing. It was brilliant, really.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. It's a superb book. It's really nice to have a friend sort of write the memoir when you're in it a lot. Yeah, that was really convenient. I couldn't remember a lot of it. So,
and I've got Steve McQueen by her as well, which is a great book as well. So it just seems a bit mad. So Wedding Present, have I read this correctly that you're releasing 2 songs a month for all of 2022?
Yeah, apparently, because I'm not busy enough as it stands. Yeah, we've got most of them done, and also David's tried to move things around over the years and expand the sound, but I'm very much old school Wedding Present. I sort of came on board after George Best, so Bizarro, Sea Monsters, and the last time they did a single a month, the Hit Parade. They're my sort of trio of just Wedding Present albums to love. So it's that hopefully sort of classic Wedding Present sound that I'm going for. That I think
you've changed your gear as well, haven't you? Because you're normally playing, is it an Ibanez Art Core with Sleeper, but you're playing a telly with
that's what the guitarist plays in that lineup over the years. I would rather have a large body guitar because it disguises my inevitable middle-aged weight gain, but
that's why I play a White Falcon. It covers basically from my knees to my chest.
Yeah, that's exactly why I got the hollow body, but sadly David gets to play that one in the Wedding Present, so I don't. There's quite a lot of it on the record that sounded good on the various tracks we've done. And another, just a great top line writer and a really good lyricist, which you can't. People, obviously, a band's only as good as its drummer, but you need a good top line writer and lyricist as well, I think, and a distinctive voice. And I kind of like David because he writes, he plays that 1/4 of the Great Love Song and does it brilliantly. And I kind of got interested in the psychology of that because there are sort of different ways that people write about relationships from different perspectives, and his being that kind of northern bloke in relationship is one particular one that I kind of identify with. But the psychology behind it, not to pull it back to the book, but the last chapter on the book is that one that looks at evolutionary psychology and religion. And evolutionary psychology is a very difficult subject to grasp. It's a very simple one. We don't have a problem with our diet. We all know something along the lines of the raw food diet, the paleo diet. We used to eat in a certain way and now we don't, and we live in a food toxic environment, which is why we all prefer a larger guitar, and and that's largely because of our food preferences evolved over hundreds of thousands of probably millions of years when we were surviving in a calorie scarce environment. So we're triggered hugely by sugars, and so those kind of evolutionary things that are embedded in our psychology can be quite tricky to talk about. And I think David does it quite unknowingly with his love songs. You can see them occasionally in relationship songs. The Shape of You is clearly, you would imagine, an evolutionary psychologist, I'm just riffing here, but an evolutionary psychologist may well say The Shape of You is a guy singing about a girl because men are visually stimulated, whereas Put a Ring on It is clearly from a woman's perspective, because in the evolutionary psychology of relationships, which is where it gets really difficult, that's men and women have different preferences in terms of what they look for, and that's a really challenging area to go down, and not one that I generally explore very much. The two safe areas, right? Food, because we all know the whole sugar evolutionary cycle. Imagine when sugar was as rare as it was in the ancient environment, when fruits were a tenth the size of what they are today, when an apple was as big as your thumb and bitter as hell and contained maybe 7 calories, and you existed almost entirely on roots that you dug up. No one craves cabbage. You've never ever heard anyone say, I have the first cabbage leaf, I just can't help but finish the head. Right?
No.
Whereas
no one's ever said that.
First chocolate out of the box, it's gone. And that's because it triggers a thing. And so it's fine to talk about, and in the Dylan and Lennon one, I use evolutionary psychology and religion, because I'd had a faith experience when I joined Narcotics Anonymous, and it's quite a spiritual program. And then I lost that faith after about 14 years, and still stayed, active and in recovery and stuff. But I was really interested in the processes of how those things happen to you. And both Dylan and Lennon were avowed atheists at various periods in their early life, and then both had quite strong supernatural experiences. And I think Dylan still is very much loads of his songs, even pretty much one song on every album he's done since his so-called Great Religious Trilogy is a very, very strong Christian song on pretty much every album, if you look for it. And he's just, those tropes crop up on all his radio shows, and there's hundreds of quotes from the Bible as a literary source. And Lennon, fascinated by numerology and Egyptology and Vedic traditions and all that stuff, and just careers from one crazy supernatural form to another, including like crazy diets and the Osho diet and all this kind of weird stuff. And so they're both, whilst they're both great, inspiring, revolutionary, independent thinkers, they're both extremely vulnerable to these spiritual, religious, thought reform practices.
It's very much part of rock and roll, though, isn't it? Because you could say, like Robert Johnson's songs, which is probably the starting point.
Yeah.
But also, Little Richard is in the same boat. Jerry Lee Lewis is in the same boat.
The argument is, and I was exploring this with someone who'd sort of grown up as an atheist, Yorkshire miners' strike, went to university to become a agitator or whatever, very strong atheist, then had a faith experience and then lost it about 14 years later. So it's just, evolutionary psychology has a very, very strong explanatory system for how those things work, and it's to do with our respect for our forebears, our ability to have a conversation with someone who's not in the room. which we do in our head. When I get home, I must tell my partner this. So our ability to separate mind and body, the mind-body duality, all of these things invite ultimately religious ideas into our lives and spiritual ideas, and it's a very strong way of organizing ourselves because it doesn't involve violence, because we're quite weak as mammals go, yet we evolved to act collectively so efficiently that we managed to wipe out all the other large mammals that were threats to us, whether it's saber-toothed tigers or mammoths. In evolutionary terms, you look at humans arrive in North America, within a few thousand years, all the mammoths have gone, all the saber-toothed tigers have gone. Literally, it's like a light switch going off. All the horses, American Indians had horses when indigenous Americans grew up with horses, and then they just ate them all. Although they managed to do a better job of curating the buffalo herds, and they, which became staples their life. So it's this idea that we romanticize these old societies about somehow being at one with nature. I think it's a bit of that sort of noble savage myth, and we've been at war in nature, desperately trying to survive as quite weak animals ever since we evolved. And the way we've managed to do that is through the ability to act collectively and communicate with each other at a very high level compared to any other monkey / chimp / common ancestor. The psychology that inspires religion is the same psychology that inspires collective action. Our moral precepts. We have basic moral precepts that we all agree on that are evolved, and lots of other things like that. Our ability to use language and all that. Shame's a great one. Imagine 150. It seems likely that we evolved in group sizes of around 150, which is roughly the amount of associates you can keep in a diary today, in your phone today, coincidentally. Imagine 100 guys with burning sticks trying to herd a mammoth off a cliff top so that they can then carve it up and eat it and make clothes out of it, or a buffalo or whatever. The one guy hanging back, who's doing the sensible thing about, I'll just let your man go up the front there because that thing's really big and really angry. That's where guilt and shame, it's argued, come from. That's like, dude, you need to get up here. And so guilt evolves as a feeling to enable us to do the moral correct thing, and shame evolves as a tool for us to encourage others to do that, because we don't want to be shamed. And the worst thing that could happen to you in the evolutionary time, which let's not forget is 99% of human existence, pre-contemporary culture, right? Our modern cultural world has existed for a tiny fraction of the length humans looking just like you and me have been on this on Earth. So the ability to act collectively became really important, and that's where groupthink and religious ideas and religious ideas inspire people to act together when they've never even met each other, without any need for any physical violence, which is quite a powerful thing. Which is why I think ultimately even great thinkers like Dylan, or great activists or brilliantly independent people, famously obstreperous, individualistic thinkers who just go out on their own, like Bob Dylan and John Lennon, are equally as vulnerable to those kind of psychological mechanisms as anyone else. So the evolutionary psychology thing, I think it's a fascinating area. It's a dangerous one because it's allied with a lot of quite conservative politics, and I think ultimately it's either true or it's not. And if it is true that we carry evolutionary ghosts in our thinking, then progressive people need to jump on board and work out how that can be a helpful thing to help us solve some of our problems, say diet, or say thought reform in an unhealthy way, unhealthy forms of groupthink and things like that, which are very well explained. And that I just did a chapter in a book called One Hit Wonders on Sugar Sugar by the Archies, right?
Oh yeah.
Which basically argues that sugar is used as a metaphor for romantic desire, or romantic plus sexual desire. And they're both triggering the same reward systems. And they're both completely necessary for us to have survived. Everybody, all of us on this Zoom call, everyone listening to this podcast is part of an unbroken chain of life that runs back possibly 4 billion years. The first single cell animal that came out of, whatever sea was there at the time. And that's through reproduction and food. And there it is in Sugar Sugar by the Archies. Oh, it's fascinating.
When you said in the book that Lennon didn't believe in evolution.
That's really? One of them. Yeah, both of them. John Lennon, within months of each other, John Lennon, because of the Vedic tradition. So in Hinduism, you believe in evolution, but not human evolution. And Hare Krishnaism, my partners are Hare Krishna. They don't believe humans are art. You got to remember cows are sacred because they reincarnate into humans. Yeah. So, that's not exactly Darwinian scheme of biology. So, one of the great ironies and one of the brilliant things about dual biography, this idea that from Eloise Naphay, that by looking at two people together, you discover more than you would as an individual, is this idea that within months of each other in the late 70s, they both publicly, very, very forcefully denied any possibility of human evolution. Dylan, because he joined a fundamentalist Christian church that became a young earth creationist, and Lennon because he was still very much, people say Lennon wasn't spiritual. He was very much mired in the Vedic traditions, and in the Vedic traditions humans didn't evolve. And he literally says, I don't believe we came from monkeys. I don't believe that. It's garbage. Now, what was the discovery that caused Lennon to make that statement? It was the so-called missing link, which is Lucy, the early hominin, named after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by John Lennon, which is just this incredible, weird, and there's Lennon going, I don't believe in all that. We came from monkey stuff. And the whole reason why in the 70s that's news, it's because anthropologists had discovered this quote-unquote missing link, and along with Turkana Boy and all these early human skeletons, hominin, pre-Homo sapiens, started being discovered in various valleys around Ethiopia and stuff. And the very first one, the one that hit the headlines, they were going to name it a traditional name, but they'd had a tape of Sergeant Pepper's playing endlessly in the camp that they were in. So they called her Lucy because they thought it was a female. They called her Lucy after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Lennon's own song, which is just brilliant. And then a few months later, he's like, yeah, that's garbage. Don't believe that.
Do you ever think, though, because I'm a big fan of both of the artists, and, I've read a lot more about the Beatles than I have Dylan. And when I say I'm a big fan of Dylan, I'm really a big fan of Dylan in that sort of 60s period, with a couple of albums in the 70s, and after that I'm kind of done because he starts doing that weird voice thing that he does. But sometimes I read sort of like interviews with him, and I went, are they just bored and taking the piss? Are they just literally making this shit up for column inches?
Yeah, I think he became just such a huge figure, and I guess the challenge is that he was on his own, and the Beatles were a gang, so they had each other to support each other, much in the in the way maybe Ringo did when Lennon was doing sort of inadvisable public gestures, and in their songwriting as well. So Dylan, maybe you could argue, loses track on a few albums, whereas the Beatles, they might have famously, the so-called White Album might be better off as one disc rather than two, but there's still some great stuff on it, or when Lennon's struggling to create, McCartney's pushing it forward, as you see in Let It Be, and so and then you get McCartney sort of re-saccharine songwriting, and then Lennon's like one note straight to the truth stuff.
I love that bit in Get Back where, and forgive me, I can't remember what the exact words are, but like McCartney's strumming a guitar, and he's like, I saw us standing there, and Lennon just looks up and goes, waiting would be better.
Yeah.
And that's his only contribution to it, but it just changes it so it's right.
Yeah. But that's the great thing about that collaborative songwriting element. Sometimes it is just a one word, and that's what, because it's when you're with an artist who's a great lyricist, they could write a really, really great lyric, and you've got the luxury of being able to just read this thing they've poured their heart and soul into it and go, well, if you change that one word there, it just becomes a work of genius then. And because they're too close to the trees to see it. And I've seen that happen and been involved in that process occasionally, and just been able to have, because you've got the headspace to find the metaphor that works when they're so married to what they've done and they're so mired in it. They're so, absolutely, they've worked through it and they've created it from nothing, and they've created this really good thing. And then to have, as Lennon does there, to have someone go, how about you put that word in? Which is, a great thing of the collaborative process, whereas Dylan didn't have that. So I think he's more vulnerable to that kind of thing, although much more cynical and much more world weary than I think John was, which is, it goes back to the whole protest thing about why he stepped away from that. And Lennon much more naively dove into it, being completely naive about the realities of American political
I always
life.
got the impression, and I've never met John Lennon, obviously, but I've met a few people that have been very passionate, peace, love, and I always look at them and go, what are you hiding? How much of a dick were you before you kind of flipped a 180? And the stuff I've read about Lennon, and I have no idea how much I can't remember what that film's called with what was where they're basically the Hamburg days and they've got the bass player.
Yeah. Backbeat, is it?
Backbeat.
Carnegie Hall. That's the venue. Carnegie Hall. There you go.
A podcast full of middle-aged men trying to remember stuff.
Yeah. I haven't taken my pills yet today. I'm sorry.
But I just wondered whether Lennon, because he kind of admits to being quite violent younger, and I just wondered whether the peace stuff was trying to atone in his own head.
Yeah, I think
the stuff that he'd done.
I think possibly to a certain extent, and I don't know. I think you have you have a lot more energy when you're younger, and sometimes it's misdirected, and I'm just I think when I was younger I was very intensely political, and I'm trying to be less so today, and just someone who just tries to study things and do no harm sort of vibe, rather than actively. I guess I'm suspicious of whenever a movement happens, it's always a radical person with the bullhorn, isn't it, leading it, often pulling along a lot of other people who sort of see something good, but perhaps on the same page as the original motivator was. Even the miners' strike, we never had a ballot over that. I think a lot of the Yorkshire miners who joined in with that in good faith, including members of my family, and suffered terribly because of it. They were supporting Scargill, who was a pretty radical figure who never held a proper ballot on that strike. And so it's interesting that the leaders don't often represent the people that they assume they do. They're usually much more radical. And I think that's Dylan's story in a way. You look at the people Lennon got involved with in New York in the early 70s politically. John Lennon absolutely fell headfirst into the Fourth International. Tariq Ali and pretty culty Workers' Revolutionary type party. Actually not Workers' Revolutionary, more Leninist, so more about sort of the vanguard Revolutionary Communist Party type stuff, the sort of intellectual vanguard that's going to lead the people to victory over capitalism, and absolutely launched himself headfirst into that. And some of those movements can be quite culty. I was around SWP for a while, and then I was like, wow, this just feels weird. I don't know, I'm not in Scientology. And because you want to do good, but you just don't, you don't necessarily know what the right thing to do is. They can be very convincing because there's a kernel of truth in all of it. And I guess Dylan's just much more cynical and much more standoffish, and very rarely got involved in any, stood off from Live Aid, says the wrong thing at Live Aid purposefully because he doesn't want to be part. He's suspicious about movements as a whole and almost never gets involved in them. And I think most English people underestimate the role of transcendentalism, which is this great sort of romantic 19th century American literary movement, principally that was all about the individual and Thoreau and march to the beat of a different drum and all that stuff. Which, if you grew up in Europe or the United Kingdom and you went to university in the 80s or 90s, you learn about Marx and collective action and the labor tradition. And in America, you learned about, certainly on the East Coast and in the sort of middle of America where Dylan grew up, you learn much more about nature and individualism, which are the central tenets of the transcendental movement, which we don't really know that much about here. And it's often overlooked in his work. How much Dylan, the great voice of a generation, what are the metaphors he uses? They're biblical metaphors and they're weather metaphors, because he grew up in the plains in America. And pretty much every, including his song about John Lennon, it's got wind. It's about the wind and the storms and all that stuff. He grew up was born on the edge of the Great Lakes, where these huge storms would wreak havoc. It was like an inland sea, and very, very, hot and humid in summer and cold and blowy in winter. And you know about the weather if you live in that part of the world, and hurricanes in September and stuff. He's got a song called Hurricane, for God's sake. It's like
he has. It's one of my favourites.
His very first Bob Dylan radio show is about the weather. The first song he plays in it, Blow Wind Blow, like blowing in the wind. All of his songs, huge amounts of his songs, have got biblical and weather metaphors, and they're about the individual. So he very rarely uses collective nouns. It's all about I. I and I is one song, for example, although it's not necessarily a protest song, but lots of his songs are about individual experiences. And even when he does use collective nouns, it's the story of a small, a couple of people involved in some situation, like in Oxford Town. He uses a collective noun, but it's just him and his girlfriend getting involved in this protest. He's not part of the protest. He's just him and his partner at the time are swept up in it. So it's like he's very much an individualist, and Lennon's very much kind of a traditional British class-based thinker. That's what I take from their music and their lyrics, and that's Lennon's in the band. Dylan, although he wants a band, he never really gets one together. He works with about 60 different musicians. Gets a band together, and within about 4 years, he's literally worked with 60 different musicians. So he's ploughing his own furrow. He's very much an individualist. I
was reading a biography on the Heartbreakers, who were, of course, his backing band at some point in the 70s, 80s, possibly 80s, early 80s. And after a couple of years of being his backing band, they were just pretty much broken and had to just basically retire and go back to America and become the Heartbreakers again, because it was just so exhausting. Which is funny, because then Tom Petty goes on to form the Travelling Wilburys with him.
And that's one of the few times he does get involved in a group, in a gang. That and the church situation. That's one of the few times he does. And I think that with the church, it's obviously something very personal, deep happens inside. He feels, he finds Jesus and God, and that's going to be a life-changing experience for anybody who goes through that journey. So that's something that it's so profound. It absolutely reorients his entire worldview away from this individualism towards this collective vineyard church movement that he joins, which has got to be a pretty shattering event for any individual psychologically. It clearly absolutely changed his thinking at a very fundamental level for the period that it lasted. And with the Traveling Wilburys, again, I think that's a musician thing. He was with songwriters and musicians, particularly Roy Orbison's massive Roy Orbison fan. Writes about Orbison for pages in his memoir, and gets to be in a band with him. So who, it's like me during the wedding present. It's like, yeah, who's going to say no to that? Like, obviously. So that's the, you find God or you find a great band. That's the one time he's going to step away from that individualist tradition. But in the United Kingdom and Europe, I think which is where most, until recently, most Dylan scholars have come from, we don't really get that individualist tradition. I think he's probably much more small c conservative American than most of us would like to think.
Well, I mean, it's just the thing with American politics, though, isn't it? I remember a school teacher telling me when I was asking about Republican or Democrat sort of thing. And they went, well, it's like voting Conservative or like voting Tory.
Yeah.
There is no left in America. There's just small c or big C.
But if you read his memoir, which is a really interesting document with Dylan, like it's all about family. It's all about, he blatantly says, my favourite 60s American politician was Barry Goldwater, who was a pretty right-wing conservative Republican. And people are like, well, he's just having a laugh, isn't he? I'm like, well, no, he's written a book about his life. You suggesting he just put that in to wind you up. Maybe it's true, and maybe he stepped back because maybe, like you suggested, he found something a bit more sinister in a lot of holier than thou people that he was hanging around with, and he just wanted to just like step back from it to a certain extent. And that sounds quite reasonable when you think about the pressure he's been put under to be the voice of a generation, and the ego. Bob Dylan found Jesus, which is quite a humble thing to do. You surrender yourself to God to the extent that he pissed off his entire fan base. John Lennon, the big political campaigner, thought he was Jesus. He called a meeting of the band to say, I think I'm the second coming. And Ringo's like, well, I'm going for lunch. And goes off and has an egg and chips down the road.
But isn't that the great thing about being mates can say that stuff? When you're being a dick, only really good mates can kind of go, whatever, mate, and just kind of bring you straight back down to earth.
But I think that's the difference in sort of the ego between. I think John bought into his own, ideas maybe more than Bob did, and it left him vulnerable politically and spiritually into lots of strange cult stuff. I mean, if you look at the various thought reform movements that Lennon's been involved with, there's a long list of them. From strange diet things to the song Mother, which is his version of primal scream therapy. He just goes one after the other. And there's a great Freudian analysis of him in a book, The Beatles and Lacan, that I mentioned before we started recording, that basically suggests his story is a lifelong search for a father figure, which, starts off with the band's manager and then George Martin, who's the producer, and then sort of slips into various political figures and religious figures. And he's just bouncing from one to the other because his dad, left to join the Merchant Navy. And there's this incredible moment when I can't remember how old he was, 6 or 9 or whatever it was, where his dad and his mum take him to Blackpool and go, his dad at the time was going to Australia or New Zealand. And they're like, you choose. And he walks off with his dad to go to New Zealand, and then gets halfway down the pier and turns around and runs back to be with his mum. It's that's a pretty profound Freudian thing going on there, and it reappears in his music and his relationships, I think, throughout his life. Some of which are quite political. The way that he is such a culturally powerful individual, just buys into quite a lot of the hippie movement when he gets to New York, stuff that's pretty nonsensical, and his feet first straight in, no question. Yeah, I'll do that. It's quite a bizarre way of behaving for someone who has become taken over from Bob Dylan as the voice of a generation, the single most important popular music songwriter of his era, the most culturally influential, you could argue, songwriter and musician of the post-war era. If you had to pick one, him and Elvis, just absolutely gung-ho for any crazy idea that comes along. Yeah, he's supposed to be this great, individualist thinker or activist or whatever, but it's just one thing after another, which I think is quite endearing in a way. But
I do think though that when you're exposed to that much fame, is it any different to Britney Spears stood in a shop shaving her head? Yeah. I never got any fame whatsoever. I think if I had had even a modicum of success, I'd have been a bloody lunatic.
As Louise describes it, fame is a mental illness, and I think it's a perfectly natural thing, but way for him to have responded to it in a way.
I mean, I drank enough in my 20s without being in a band.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Without being in a successful band, I should say. So anyway, we should probably wrap it up because we've been yakking for much longer than we said we were going to yak for.
I hope this makes sense. That's the main thing.
This is probably the most intellectual podcast we have ever done. And given that last week we were interviewing Frank Bello from Anthrax.
Excellent.
It's very much night and day. Thank you. I've really enjoyed that conversation.
Thanks for having me on.
And that was John Stewart. And I'm now chatting to Jace, and it's a couple of weeks after we've recorded that. And I've heard that for the first time this afternoon, and it's a fascinating conversation, Jay.
I really enjoyed it. I've known John for a few years. We both had a similar job at BIM, me in Birmingham, him at Brighton. And when I started, I found him really intimidating, because he's so smart. But actually, turns out he's a really nice guy. So I really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed nerding out about Lennon and Dylan. Really, so really cool.
Well, it is a bit of a different chat for us, but it's for something that's quite highbrow. It's also very accessible.
I don't think I've ever done anything highbrow in my life.
No. Well, no. And to be fair, it's a complete curveball for me as well. You're doing something highbrow, if I'm being honest. But no, and do you know what? Quite nice every once in a while to hear one of these that I've not heard before. Because obviously, not being in the session, it's like being a punter.
I hope you enjoyed it.
I did. The one thing we must do is thank Focusrite.
Yes.
Because obviously they're beautiful and wonderful and brilliant. They continue to support the podcast. So thank you very much for continuing to do what you do. And that's about it. I'm just about to go. I'm having a late Sunday tea. So
well, I've just cooked Sunday dinner.
Have you?
Yeah. We've just finished washing up, which is always the worst part of Sunday dinner.
Right. Well, this is the last bit of anything I'm doing. Then I'm going to have a glass of red wine with a bit of Sunday tea.
Lovely.
Right.
Well, have fun.
Yes, you too, and I'll catch up with you soon.
All right, mate. See you later. Bye.
Yeah, take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to 9 to 42, the podcast from the team at the Guitar Show UK. If you've enjoyed the show, then please remember to hit the subscribe button and share with other like-minded souls. For more information about 9 to 42, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram at the Guitar Show UK. This has been an A Short Stories production.